The torchlight sputters, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn stone of the Frankish hall. Outside, the wind howls across the northern plains, a sound as old as the tribes that once roamed them. But tonight, the cold is not the enemy. The enemy is a boy, barely into manhood. His shoulders are not yet broad enough for the weight of the iron crown being prepared for him. His name is Pepin, and his father, the most powerful man in the Merovingian kingdom, lies on a bed of furs in the corner, his breath a shallow, rattling whisper. The great lords of the realm stand in a tense circle, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. They do not see a king, they see a child. But the boy's mother, a woman of iron named Bega, leans close to his. Her words are not a lullaby, they are a command. You will not rule by blood, she hisses, her eyes glinting in the firelight, but by the strength of your arm and the cunning of your mind. Our enemies are already sharpening their knives. You must be sharper. In that single breath, the course of European history pivots. It is not a coronation that begins the story of the Carolingian. It is a survival, a desperate, brutal gamble in a single, smoky room. To understand the dynasty that would forge an empire and lay the foundation for the modern world, we must first stand in the shadow of that torchlight and watch a family fight for its very existence. The old world was dying, but no one had yet summoned the courage to announce it. In the waning years of the 7th century, the kingdom of the Franks stretched across what is now France and western Germany, a sprawling patchwork of dense forests, muddy river valleys, and walled towns that had once answered to Rome. But the glory was gone. The kings who bore the long, golden hair of the Merovingian dynasty, a sacred tradition said to separate them from common men, sat upon thrones that had become little more than ornamental chairs. They were called Rois Faineants, the do-nothing kings. They traveled from one royal estate to another in ox-drawn carts, surrounded by a dwindling retinue of loyalists, their seals affixed to documents they did not read, their names signed to laws they did not understand. Power, like water seeking the lowest ground, had flowed elsewhere. It had pooled in the hands of a single office, the mayor of the palace. The mayor was supposed to be a steward, a household manager tasked with running the king's estates and overseeing the daily machinery of government. But in a kingdom where the king was a figurehead, the steward became the sovereign in all but name. He commanded the army. He dispensed justice. He collected the taxes. He decided which noble houses rose and which fell. And by the middle of the 7th century, one family had grasped this office with such ruthless determination that they had made it hereditary. Their name was Arnulfing, after an ancestor named Arnulf, a bishop who had served the Merovingian court. But history would come to know them by another name, the Carolingian. To understand how a family of stewards became the architects of Europe, we must begin with a man named Pepin of Herstal. He was the grandson of Arnulf and the product of a political marriage designed to unite two powerful Frankish clans. His father, Ansegisel, had been assassinated by political rivals when Pepin was still a boy, a brutal lesson that the world rewards neither kindness nor hesitation. From that moment, Pepin understood that the family's survival depended on one thing alone: the consolidation of power, so absolute that no enemy could find a crack in the wall. He was not a tall man, nor a physically imposing one. The chronicles describe him as deliberate, slow to anger, and terrifying in his patience. While the Merovingian kings rode in their carts, Pepin rode at the head of army. While the kings signed documents they could not comprehend, Pepin negotiated with the great magnates of Austrasia, the eastern, more Germanic heartland of the Frankish realm, and forged alliances that turned rivals into vassals. His great triumph came in the year 687 at the Battle of Tertry, where he led the Austrasian army against the Neustrians, the western Franks who had long dominated the kingdom. The victory was decisive. Pepin did not seize the throne. That would have been too bold, too sudden, too dangerous. Instead, he did something far more cunning. He installed a compliant Merovingian king on the throne and named himself mayor of the palace for all the Frankish realm. He became the power behind the crown, and he made certain that everyone understood it. For the next 27 years, Pepin of Herstal ruled the Franks with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. He did not abolish the old dynasty, he simply rendered it irrelevant. The Merovingian kings performed their rituals, grew their hair, and signed their documents, but the real business of the realm, the granting of lands, the declaration of wars, the settling of disputes, happened in the halls where Pepin held court. He rewarded his followers with estates seized from rebellious nobles. He placed his relatives in positions of authority across the kingdom. He built a network of loyalty that owed nothing to the fatting mystique of Merovingian blood and everything to the promise of protection and profit. To the great lords of the Franks, it became increasingly clear that the future lay not with the long-haired figurehead in the cart, but with the grim-faced mayor who held the sword. Yet even as Pepin fortified his family's position, he could not escape the fundamental vulnerability of his position. He was not a king. He could not claim the sacred legitimacy that the Merovingians possessed. However hollow that legitimacy had become, his power rested on force and patronage, and force could be met with force. Patronage could be outbid. If his family faltered for a single moment, the great lords would turn on them like wolves on a wounded stag. This was the lesson Pepin instilled in his sons, and it was a lesson that would prove prophetic when, after his death in 714, the wolves indeed descended. Pepin left behind a complicated succession. His eldest son, Drogo, had died before him, leaving behind young grandsons. His other legitimate son, Grimoald, was assassinated in a political intrigue shortly before Pepin's own death, a murder that threw the succession into chaos. And then there was Charles. Charles was a bastard, born to a woman named Alpeda, one of Pepin's concubines. In the eyes of the great nobles and the Merovingian court, Charles was nothing, an illegitimate son with no claim to the inheritance. A footnote in the annals of the powerful. His stepmother, Plectrude, who had been Pepin's chief wife, moved quickly to seize power on behalf of her own young grandson. She had Charles arrested and thrown into a prison in Cologne, hoping to extinguish the threat of the bastard before it could ignite. But she underestimated the blood that ran in his veins. Charles was a young man when he escaped from that prison, perhaps 24 years old. The details of his flight are lost to history, shrouded in the kind of silence that often accompanies the most desperate moments of a life. What matters is what happened next. He emerged in the forests of Austrasia, the heartland of his family's support, and he began to gather men. They were not the great lords with their vast retinues and fortified estates. They were the lesser nobles, the freemen, the warriors who remembered that the Arnulfing name had once meant protection and prosperity. To them, Charles was not a bastard. He was the son of Pepin, the grandson of the great Arnulfing line, and he carried the blood of warriors. The war that followed was brutal and unforgiving. Charles fought not for a crown but for his own survival, and that desperation forged him into something formidable. He defeated his stepmother's forces, forcing Plectrude to surrender Cologne and the vast Arnulfing treasure she had hoarded. He turned against the Neustrian nobles who had seen Pepin's death as an opportunity to reclaim their independence, crushing them in battle and forcing them back into submission. He fought the Saxons raiding across the eastern frontiers and the Frisians pushing down from the northern coast. In the space of a few years, the bastard who had been thrown into a prison had done what no one thought possible. He had reunited the Frankish kingdom under his own authority. It was during these years that Charles earned the name by which history would remember him. The chronicles do not record who first called him Martellus, the hammer, but the name captured something essential about the man. He was not a strategist of subtle maneuvering like his grandfather. He was a battering ram. When enemies rose against him, he did not negotiate. He marched. When rivals challenged his authority, he did not compromise. He destroyed them. The Frankish world in the early 8th century was a place of constant warfare, a cauldron of competing tribes, ambitious nobles and fatting Roman structures, and Charles Martel moved through it like a force of nature, shattering everything that stood in his path. Yet for all his military prowess, Charles faced the same fundamental problem that had haunted his grandfather. He was not a king. The Merovingians still sat on the throne, their long hair still flowing, their seals still affixed to documents. Charles did not bother to imprison or depose them. He simply ignored them. He ruled as mayor of the palace, commanding armies, collecting taxes, granting lands, and dispensing justice, while the do-nothing kings continued their pathetic processions from estate to estate. But the contradiction gnawed at the foundation of his power. What would happen when he was gone? His sons would inherit not a crown but an office that had been made hereditary by force, but that still lacked the sacred sanction of tradition. How long could a family rule through sheer strength before the great lords began to wonder why they should not rule themselves? The question might have consumed Charles's later years if the world had not presented him with a more immediate threat. In the year 732, a vast army crossed the Pyrenees and began moving north through the province of Aquitaine. They were not raiders seeking plunder. They were the advance guard of the Umayyad Caliphate, a Muslim empire that had swept across North Africa, conquered the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, and now looked north toward the rich lands of the Franks. Their horsemen were the finest cavalry in the world, armored and disciplined, bred to the saddle from childhood. Their generals had never known defeat. The cities of Aquitaine fell before them like ripe grain before a scythe. Bordeaux was sacked. The great church of Saint-Hilaire in Poitiers was burned. The army of Duke Odo of Aquitaine, the most powerful noble in the south, was crushed in a battle that left the Frankish resistance shattered. The road to the heart of the Frankish kingdom lay open. Charles Martel understood what the nobles of Aquitaine had refused to accept. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. The Umayyads did not come to plunder and withdraw. They came to conquer, to add the lands of the Franks to the dominion of the Caliphate, to plant the crescent where the cross had stood for centuries. Everything Charles had fought for, the unification of the Frankish realm, the consolidation of his family's power, the fragile structure of authority he had built from the ashes of his father's legacy, would be swept away if he could not stop them. He gathered his army and marched south. He did not summon the Merovingian king to lead. He did not seek the blessing of the church, though it would come. He simply moved as he had always moved, placing himself at the head of the Frankish warriors who had followed him through a decade of civil war and frontier skirmishes. They were not the equal of the Umayyad cavalry. They were infantry, fighting on foot, their armor consisting of leather and chainmail, their weapons axes and spears passed down from their fathers. They looked at the army massing before them, the glint of steel, the banners of a foreign god, the disciplined ranks of horsemen who had never tasted defeat, and they must have wondered if they were marching to their graves. But Charles Martel saw something did not. He saw that the Umayyad army, for all its power, was far from its bases of supply. He saw that the Frankish warriors, for all their lack of cavalry, were fighting on ground they knew, in a season that favored the defender. He saw that the Umayyad general, accustomed to swift victories over fractured opposition, had never faced a unified Frankish kingdom led by a commander who used to break. And so he made a decision that would echo through the century. He did not attack. He chose his ground, a ridge overlooking the road between Tours and Poitiers, and he waited. For 7 days, the two armies faced each other across the plain. The Umayyad cavalry charged again and again, their horses laboring up the slope, their lances lowered, their war cries rising to the cold October sky. And each time, the Frankish line held. Charles had arrayed his men in a great square, a wall of shields and spears that absorbed the charges and refused to break. The chroniclers who recorded the battle would describe a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. The bodies of horsemen and foot soldiers piling up at the edge of the Frankish formation, the ground turning to mud beneath the weight of the dead. On the 7th day, the Umayyad commander, Abdul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, saw that his army was faltering. His horsemen were exhausted, his supplies were dwindling, and the Frankish line still stood, unbroken, unmoved, a wall of iron and faith that had proved impervious to everything he could throw against it. He ordered a final charge, a desperate attempt to shatter the enemy before his own army collapsed. The Frankish warriors braced behind their shield, the axes and spears rising, the cold wind carrying the sound of prayer from Christian lips and war cries from Muslim throats. The charge broke against the shield wall, like waves against a cliff. And then, in the chaos of the fighting, a rumor swept through Umayyad ranks. Frankish scouts had been seen circling toward their camp where they had left their plunder, the gold, the silver, the captives taken from the cities of Aquitaine. The soldiers who had fought for 7 days without rest, who had seen their comrades fall against the unyielding Frankish line, suddenly found their discipline dissolving. Men began to break ranks, turning back to protect their treasure. The retreat that began as a trickle became a flood, and as the Umayyad army dissolved into chaos, the Franks surged forward, driving their enemies from the field. Abdul-Rahman was surrounded and killed. His army, the greatest fighting force the Frankish kingdom had ever faced, fled south, leaving behind their dead, their supplies, and their dreams of conquest. The hammer had struck, and the blow would resound for 1,000 years. The Battle of Tours, as it came to be known, was not the end of the Umayyad threat. Muslim forces would raid Frankish territory for generations, and it would be centuries before the last Moorish presence was expelled from Europe. But the battle marked a turning point, a moment when the tide of history shifted. Charles Martel had done more than defeat an army. He had preserved Christian Europe as a distinct civilization, a bulwark against the expansion of the caliphate. In the centuries that followed, historians would debate the significance of the battle, some claiming it saved Western Christendom, others arguing that the Umayyad advance was already overextended. But for the men who stood on that ridge, for the Frankish warriors who held the line against the finest cavalry in the world, there was no debate. They had been tested, and they had not broken, and the man who led them had earned a place in the memory of his people that no Merovingian king could ever claim. When Charles Martel returned from the battlefield, he carried with him more than victory. He carried a new kind of authority, one that rested not on the fading mystique of Merovingian blood, but on the undeniable reality of power made manifest. He had saved the Franks. He had protected the church. He had proven, in a way that no argument could refute, that the family of Pepin of Herstal was not merely the power behind the throne, but the power upon which the very existence of the kingdom depended. Yet even as he stood at the apex of his authority, the hammer must have known that his work was unfinished. He had consolidated his family's position. He had defended the realm against its most dangerous enemy, but he had not solved the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his power. He was still a mayor, still a steward, still a servant of a crown he did not wear. The question of legitimacy, the question of kingship, the question of what the Arnulfing family become after his death, these questions remained unanswered, waiting for the man who would inherit his sword. The victory at Tours had made Charles Martel a legend, but legends are poor comfort to the men who must live in their shadow. For Pepin, the younger son of the hammer, the inheritance was as much burden as blessing. When Charles died in 741, he divided his realm between Pepin and his elder brother, Charlemagne, a division that spoke to the old Frankish tradition of partible inheritance, but ignored the reality that their power rested on unity. For a time, the brothers worked together, presenting a united front against the rebellions that erupted the moment their father's hand was lifted from the kingdom. They crushed revolts in Aquitaine and Alemannia, forced the dukes of Bavaria back into submission, and continued their father's work of consolidating Frankish authority over the disparate tribes and territories that made up the Merovingian kingdom. But Charlemagne was not built for the life of a warrior statesman. The chronicles describe a man of deep piety, a soul that chafed against the violence and intrigue that accompanied power. In 747, he did something that stunned the Frankish world. He laid down his office, traveled to Rome, and took the vows of a monk. He withdrew to the monastery of Monte Cassino, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in prayer and contemplation, leaving the entire Frankish realm in the hands of his younger brother. Pepin now stood alone. He was the sole master of the most powerful kingdom in Western Christendom, the heir to his father's hammer and his grandfather's cunning. Yet he was not a king. The Merovingian throne was still occupied by a do-nothing king named Childeric III, a man whose only qualification for rule was the long hair that marked him as a descendant of the ancient line. Childeric signed documents, traveled from estate to estate in his ox-drawn cart, and performed the ceremonial functions that the Frankish nobles still expected from their nominal sovereign. But everyone knew where the real power lay. The question was whether Pepin would have the courage to do what his father and grandfather had never done: take the final step, cast aside the fiction of Merovingian rule, and claim the crown for himself. The obstacle was not military. Pepin could have deposed Childeric with a single command, marched his warriors into the palace, and seized the throne by force. But force alone would not be enough. The Merovingian dynasty had ruled the Franks for nearly a year. Their blood was considered sacred, their long hair a symbol of a divine right that no amount of military power could entirely erase. If Pepin simply seized the throne, he would be a usurper, a king whose authority rested on nothing but the edge of a sword. His sons would inherit a crown that could be taken from them as easily as it had been taken from the Merovingian. He needed something more. He needed legitimacy. He needed the sanction of the one institution in the West that could transform a usurper into a king by the grace of God. That institution was the papacy. But in the middle of the 8th century, the papacy was a shadow of what it had once been. The popes in Rome found themselves caught between the Lombards, a Germanic people who had invaded Italy and now threatened to overrun the peninsula, and the Byzantine Empire, which still claimed authority over Rome, but was too distant and too weakened to provide meaningful protection. The Lombard king, Aistulf, was particularly aggressive, seizing Byzantine territories and making clear his intention to bring Rome itself under his control. Pope Stephen II, who ascended to the papacy in 752, faced a crisis that threatened the very existence of his office. He had no army, he had no ally, and the emperor in Constantinople, preoccupied with his own troubles, offered nothing but empty promises. Stephen needed a protector, and he needed one desperately. The man who could provide that protection was Pepin, the most powerful ruler in the West. But Pepin needed something from Stephen as well. The Pope possessed something no one else in Christendom could give: the authority to anoint a king, to declare that the ruler of the Franks held his crown not by the accident of birth or the might of his sword, but by the will of God. It was a transaction waiting to happen, a bargain that would reshape the political and religious landscape of Europe. All that remained was for the two men to find each other. In 753, Pope Stephen II did something unprecedented. He crossed the Alps to seek help from the Frankish king. No pope had ever traveled so far north, had ever placed himself so completely in the hands of a secular ruler. The journey was dangerous, the passes treacherous, the political situation uncertain. But Stephen understood that the survival of the papacy depended on this gamble. When he arrived in Frankish territory, Pepin came to meet him, and the meeting that followed was a masterpiece of political theater. According to the chronicles, Stephen prostrated himself before Pepin, begging for the protection of the Franks against the Lombard aggressor. But the gesture was as much about giving as receiving. In exchange for Pepin's military aid, Stephen would provide what Pepin needed most: the legitimacy of divine sanction. The deal was sealed at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the great monastery that stood just north of Paris. There, in a ceremony that combined the ancient traditions of the Franks with the sacred rituals of the Church, Pope Stephen II anointed Pepin as king. The holy oil, the chrism that had once been reserved for the anointing of bishops and emperors, was poured over Pepin's head. The Pope declared that it was better to have a king who wielded real power than one who merely bore the title, that the man who protected the church and governed the people was true sovereign by the will of God. The Merovingian claim, built on 3 centuries of tradition, was swept aside in a single moment. Childeric III was tonsured, his sacred long hair cut short, the symbol of his royal status destroyed, and sent to a monastery. The last of the do-nothing kings disappeared into the obscurity of a cloister, and the Carolingian dynasty was born. But the ceremony at Saint-Denis was not merely the coronation of a new king. It was the beginning of a new relationship between the Frankish kingdom and the papacy, a relationship that would define European politics for centuries. Pepin made good on his promise. He led his army across the Alps, defeated the Lombards, and forced Aistulf to surrender the territories he had seized. But Pepin did not return those territories to the Byzantine Empire, which had once controlled them. Instead, he gave them to the Pope. The donation of Pepin, as it came to be known, created the Papal States, a strip of territory stretching across central Italy that would provide the papacy with temporal power for more than 1,000 years. It was a revolutionary act, establishing the Pope as not only the spiritual head of Western Christendom, but also a secular ruler, a prince among princes. For Pepin, the creation of the Papal States was a political masterstroke. It bound the papacy to the Frankish kingdom in a relationship of mutual dependence, ensuring that the popes would look north for protection rather than east to Constantinople. It established the Carolingians as the defenders of the Church, the champions of Christendom, the dynasty that had received its crown from the hand of the vicar of Christ himself. The legitimacy that Charles Martel had never quite achieved, that Pepin of Herstal had grasped but never fully possessed, was now Pepin the Short's in full measure. He was no longer a usurper. He was a king by the grace of God. Yet even as Pepin celebrated his triumph, he must have known that the work was only beginning. He had secured his dynasty, but he had also created expectations that his successors would have to fulfill. The papacy now looked to the Franks not only for protection but for leadership, for the defense of Christendom against all its enemies. And the enemies were many. The Lombards, though defeated, were not destroyed. The Saxons to the east raided across the frontier, burning churches and killing monks. the Umayyads in Spain still dreamed of expanding northward, and to the south, a new power was rising in the Mediterranean, a dynasty that would challenge the Franks for supremacy and forge an empire of its own. The crown that Pepin had won was not a resting place but a launching point, a platform from which his successors would launch the campaigns that would transform the Frankish kingdom into something the world had not seen since the fall of Rome. Pepin died in 768, leaving his kingdom divided between his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne. The division was a return to Frankish tradition, but it was also a recipe for conflict. Charles, the elder, was already showing signs of the ambition and energy that would make him one of the most formidable rulers in European history. Charlemagne, the younger, was jealous of his brother's growing reputation and suspicious of his intentions. The two brothers circled each other warily, their rivalry threatening to undo everything their father had built. For a moment, it seemed that the Carolingian dynasty might tear itself apart before it had even truly begun. But fate, or perhaps history, had other plans. In 771, Charlemagne died suddenly, and his widow fled with her children to the court of the Lombard king, Desiderius, who had been nursing his grievances against the Franks and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Charles, now the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom, faced a choice. He could accept his brother's family as rivals, allowing them to fester in exile, or he could move decisively to eliminate the threat. The choice he made would set the stage for the most dramatic chapter in Carolingian history, a chapter that would see the family that built Europe transform itself into something far greater, an empire, a renaissance, a vision of Christendom united under a single ruler. But before the empire could be built, before the crown of the Caesars could be claimed, there would be blood. The Lombards would have to be crushed. The Saxons would have to be conquered. The papacy would have to be protected and at times controlled. And at the center of it all would stand a man who would come to be known as Charlemagne, the man who would take his father's kingdom and his grandfather's hammer and forge from them a legacy that would shape the contours of Europe for 1,000 years. The Frankish kingdom that Charles inherited in 771 was a formidable machine, but it was a machine built for a single purpose: war. Pepin had spent his reign consolidating power, forging alliances, and establishing the legitimacy of the dynasty, but he had left the work of expansion to his son. Charles understood this inheritance with the instinct of a born warrior. From his earliest years, he had been raised in the camps and on the marches, learning the art of war not from books but from the men who had followed his grandfather into battle against the Umayyads. He was a giant of a man, standing nearly 6 feet 4 inches in an age when the average male height barely reached 5 feet 7. The chronicler Einhard, who knew him personally, described a frame that was broad and powerful, a neck thick with muscle, a face that was both commanding and surprisingly gentle when at rest. He wore the simple Frankish dress, linen shirt, woolen breeches, a blue cloak that he favored above all others, and he ate the same roasted meat and coarse bread as his warrior. But there was nothing simple about the mind that operated behind that unadorned exterior. Charles spoke Latin fluently, studied Greek, and spent his evenings listening to the great works of Christian theology and Roman history being read aloud. He could not write. He would spend his later years trying to master the skill, keeping wax tablets under his pillow for practice. But his fingers, thickened by decades of sword work, never learned to form the letters with grace. But he was far from illiterate. He understood that the sword could conquer territory, but only the word could bind it together. The first task that confronted him was the Lombard problem. His brother Charlemagne's widow had fled to the court of Desiderius, the Lombard king, bringing with her Charlemagne's young son. In the treacherous world of 8th century politics, those boys represented a rival claim to the Frankish throne, a claim that Desiderius would certainly use to foment rebellion if given the opportunity. Charles had already been married to Desiderius's daughter, a political match arranged by his father, but he had set her aside, a decision that infuriated Desiderius and made war inevitable. The Lombard king began making demands, asserting control over territories that Charles considered Frankish, threatening the papacy, which had long looked to the Franks for protection. Pope Hadrian I, who had succeeded Stephen II, sent desperate appeals to Charles, begging him to intervene before the Lombards overran Rome. Charles did not hesitate. In 773, he assembled his army and crossed the Alps, leading his warriors through the same treacherous passes that Pope Stephen had navigated 2 decades earlier. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Charles did not simply attack, he outmaneuvered. He besieged Desiderius in his capital at Pavia, a siege that lasted through the winter and into the spring of 774. The Frankish warriors huddled in their camps, enduring the cold, the hunger, the boredom of waiting, while Charles maintained the pressure with relentless determination. When Pavia finally fell, Desiderius was sent to a monastery, the same fate that had befallen the last Merovingian king, and Charles added the iron crown of the Lombards to his own. He was now king of the Franks and king of the Lombards, ruler of a domain that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Adriatic. But the conquest of Lombardy was only the beginning. To the east, beyond the Rhine, lay the Saxon land, a vast expanse of forest and marsh inhabited by a people who had never been fully subdued by the Franks. The Saxons were pagan, worshipping the old gods of the Germanic tribes, Woden and Thor, the sacred trees and the running water. They lived in scattered villages, ruled by chieftains who acknowledged no central authority, and they had a habit that infuriated the Christian Franks. They raided. Every spring, when the snows melted and the rivers ran clear, Saxon war bands would cross the frontier, burning churches, killing priests, and carrying off captives to be sold into slavery. Charles had faced these raids throughout his youth, and he had resolved to end them permanently. He would not simply defend the frontier, he would eliminate it. He would conquer Saxony, incorporate it into the Frankish kingdom, and force the Saxons to accept Christianity or perish. The Saxon War, when it began, seemed like a straightforward campaign of conquest. Charles marched into Saxon territory in 772, destroyed the Irminsul, the great sacred pillar that was the center of Saxon worship, and accepted the submission of the local chief. But the Saxons did not understand submission as the Franks understood it. For them, the payment of tribute and the swearing of oaths were temporary accommodation, not permanent surrender. As soon as Charles withdrew his army, the chieftains would renounce their oaths, resume their raids, and return to the worship of their gods. Charles would march again, defeat them again, accept their submission again, and then they would rebel again. The pattern repeated itself year after year, a grinding cycle of conquest and revolt that would last for more than 3 decades. The war changed Charles. The young king who had crossed the Alps to rescue the papacy became something harder, more ruthless, more willing to use terror as a tool of statecraft. In 782, after the Saxons had once again risen in rebellion, massacring Frankish soldiers and missionaries, Charles made a decision that would stain his reputation for centuries. At Verdun, on the banks of the Aller River, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners. The massacre was not a spur-of-the-moment act of rage. It was a calculated act of terror, designed to break the Saxon will to resist. It worked, after a fashion. The Saxons who survived the massacre submitted, and many of them accepted baptism, though the sincerity of their conversion was open to question. But the massacre also revealed something about Charles that his admirers would later prefer to forget. He was a man of his age, an age that believed in the sword and the fire as instruments of divine will, an age that saw no contradiction between the command to love one's neighbor and the command to destroy those who rejected the true faith. Yet even as Charles waged war in the north, he was also building something new in the heart of his kingdom. His capital at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle in French, was not a city in the Roman sense, but it was something more than a collection of royal estates. At its center stood the Palatine Chapel, a structure of breathtaking beauty and ambition. Charles had brought architects and craftsmen from Rome and Byzantium, from the remnants of the old empire, and he had commanded them to build something that had not been seen in the West for centuries. The chapel was octagonal, modeled on the great churches of the East, its walls rising to a dome that seemed to catch the light and hold it. Marble columns, looted from Roman ruins, supported the arches. Gold leaf shimmered in the candlelight. Mosaics, created by craftsmen summoned from Ravenna, depicted Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by the 24 elders of the Apocalypse. And in the gallery above, Charles placed his throne, a simple seat of marble from which he could look down upon the altar and in that moment see himself as the earthly representative of divine order. The chapel was not merely a place of worship, it was a statement of intent. Charles was building more than a church. He was building the center of an empire, a new Rome on the banks of the Rhine. He gathered around him the greatest scholars of his age: Alcuin of York, the English deacon who would become his chief advisor on matters of education and theology; Paul the Deacon, the Lombard historian who preserved the memory of his people even as their kingdom fell; Einhard, the young Frankish scholar who would one day write the biography that shaped Charles's reputation for centuries. These men, and many others, formed the core of what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. They did not simply preserve the learning of the ancient world. They transformed it, creating a new synthesis of Christian theology and classical culture that would provide the foundation for European intellectual life for generations. Alcuin, in particular, understood what Charles was trying to achieve. He wrote treatises on grammar and rhetoric, on theology and astronomy, and he established schools across the Frankish kingdom where young men could learn to read and write, not only in Latin, but also in their native Frankish tongue. He reformed the liturgy, standardizing the texts and rituals that would be used in churches throughout the empire. He corresponded with kings and bishops, advising them on matters both spiritual and temporal, and he infused his letters with a vision of Christendom as a single, unified community of believers under the protection of a Christian emperor. In Alcuin's letters to Charles, we see the outline of a dream, a Europe united not by the sword alone, but by a common faith, a common culture, a common language of the mind and the spirit. But the dream was not yet reality. In the year 799, a crisis erupted in Rome that would force Charles to confront the question of what his empire was meant to be. Pope Leo III, who had succeeded Hadrian, was a man of humble origins who had made powerful enemies among the Roman nobility. They accused him of perjury, of adultery, of crimes so numerous and so scandalous that the charges filled a lengthy document. In April of 799, a mob attacked Leo in the streets of Rome, attempting to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue. The Pope barely escaped with his life, fleeing north to seek the protection of the Frankish king. Charles received Leo with all the honors due to his office, but he also understood that the situation presented a profound challenge. The Pope was the spiritual head of Western Christendom, the successor of Saint Peter, the man who had anointed Charles's father and consecrated the Carolingian dynasty. But this Pope was also a man accused of terrible crime, a man whose fitness to hold his office was openly questioned. Charles had the power to restore Leo to Rome, to protect him from his enemy, but in doing so, he would be exercising authority over the papacy itself. He would be acting as a judge over the vicar of Christ. The solution that Charles devised was a masterpiece of political theater. He traveled to Rome in the fall of 800, accompanied by an army large enough to ensure that no one would challenge his decision. He convened a council of Frankish and Roman bishops to hear the charges against Leo, but he did not allow the council to judge the Pope. Instead, Leo appeared before the assembly, declared his innocence, and offered to purge himself by oath. On December 23, in the presence of the assembled bishops and nobles, Leo stood before the altar of St. Peter's and swore that he was innocent of the charges against him. It was not a trial, it was a demonstration of power. Charles had shown that he could call the Pope to account, that the authority of the papacy rested in part on the approval of the Frankish king. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, Charles knelt before the altar of St. Peter's to pray. The basilica was filled with worshippers, the air thick with incense and candle smoke. The ancient church, built by the Emperor Constantine more than 4 centuries earlier, still bore the marks of its imperial origin, its columns and arches speaking of a time when Rome had ruled the world. As Charles rose from his prayers, Pope Leo III approached him, a golden crown in his hand. Before the assembled congregation, the Pope placed the crown upon Charles's head, and the people, whether by prearrangement or spontaneous acclamation, shouted in unison, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Roman, life and victory." Charles, according to the chroniclers, later claimed that he had been surprised by the coronation, that he had not wanted it, that he would not have entered the church that day if he had known what the Pope intended. The claim is almost certainly disingenuous. Charles was too shrewd a politician, too careful a planner to have left such a moment to chance. But the protest, whether genuine or feigned, reveals something important about the nature of the empire he now claimed. He wanted to be emperor, but he did not want to appear to have received his crown from the Pope. If the Pope gave him the empire, then the Pope could take it away. If he received the crown as a gift, then he owed his authority to the man who bestowed it. Charles understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life accumulating power, that the crown must appear to come from God alone. The empire that Charlemagne left behind was a monument to a single will. For 46 years, he had ruled the Franks, and for the last 14 of those years, he had worn the imperial crown that Pope Leo III had placed upon his head. But empires built on the strength of one man are fragile things. They require not only a founder but also heirs who understand what they have inherited. Charlemagne had known this. In his final years, he had done everything in his power to prepare for the transition. He had crowned his surviving son, Louis, as co-emperor. He had instructed Louis in the arts of governance, taking him on campaign, introducing him to the great men of the realm, showing him the machinery of power that had taken a lifetime to construct. But no amount of preparation could change the fundamental truth that Louis was not his father. Louis the Pious, the epithet was given to him by later chroniclers, and it captured something essential about his character, was a man of deep faith. Where Charlemagne had been a warrior who respected the church, Louis was a believer who happened to rule. He had been raised in Aquitaine, far from the rough-and-tumble politics of the Frankish heartland, and he had developed a temperament that was more suited to the cloister than the throne. He read the scriptures daily. He attended multiple masses. He consulted bishops on matters both spiritual and temporal, and he often deferred to their judgment in ways that his father never would have countenanced. When he assumed full power after Charlemagne's death in 814, he immediately set about purifying the court of what he saw as the excesses of his father's reign. He expelled his father's unmarried daughters from the palace, sending them to convents or to the estates of their husband. He dismissed the retainers and courtiers who had surrounded Charlemagne, replacing them with men of proven piety. He ordered the destruction of the pagan shrines that still dotted the empire, and he issued capitularies demanding that all subjects adhere strictly to Christian morality. The reforms were well-intentioned, but they also revealed a dangerous naivety. Louis did not understand that the empire his father had built was held together not by piety, but by patronage. Charlemagne had ruled by rewarding his followers with lands and offices, by binding the great men of the realm to his person through a web of obligations and expectation. When Louis dismissed the old courtiers and replaced them with his own men, he created a class of disaffected nobles who had lost their position, their incomes, and their status. These men did not disappear. They waited, nursing their grievances, watching for an opportunity to reclaim what they had lost. And they did not have to wait long. In 817, Louis made a decision that would set in motion the unraveling of the Carolingian Empire. He issued a document called the Ordinatio Imperii, the Ordinance of the Empire, which laid out his plans for the succession. His eldest son, Lothair, was named co-emperor and would inherit the imperial title and the heartlands of the empire. His younger sons, Pepin and Louis the German, were given subordinate kingdoms, Aquitaine and Bavaria respectively, and were made subject to Lothair's authority. The arrangement was meant to ensure stability, to prevent the kind of fratricidal warfare that had plagued the Merovingian. But it also contained a fatal flaw. It treated Louis's sons as junior partners in an enterprise that they all believed they had an equal right to rule. The system held for more than a decade, largely because Louis maintained his authority over his son. But in 829, Louis remarried. His first wife, Ermengarde, had died, and he took a new wife, Judith, a beautiful and ambitious woman from the Bavarian nobility. Judith quickly bore him a son, Charles, the future Charles the Bald, and she set about securing her child's place in the succession. The Ordinatio Imperii had not anticipated a fourth son, and Judith's maneuvering to win lands and titles for her boy destabilized the carefully constructed balance of power. Louis's older sons, who had already chafed under their father's authority, now saw their inheritance threatened. They rebelled. The rebellion of 830 was the first in a series of civil wars that would consume the Carolingian Empire for the next decade. Lothair, the co-emperor and the most powerful of Louis's sons, allied himself with his brothers and with a faction of nobles who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike at the emperor. They seized Louis, forced him to abdicate, and sent Judith to a convent. For a moment, It seemed that Lothair would succeed his father without bloodshed, but Louis the Pious, for all his piety, had learned something from his years on the throne. He did not accept his fate. He rallied his supporters, fought his way back to power, and by 831 had re-established his authority. He pardoned his sons, a gesture of Christian mercy that his father would never have made. But the damage was done. The sons had tasted rebellion, had seen that their father could be beaten, and they would not easily return to it. The next decade was a nightmare of shifting alliances, broken promises, and repeated betrayal. Louis the Pious fought his sons, reconciled with them, fought them again. The great nobles of the empire, who had once been bound to the Carolingian dynasty by loyalty and self-interest, now found that they could play one prince against another, extracting concessions and privileges from each in exchange for their support. The machinery of Carolingian governance, which Charlemagne had built to administer a vast and diverse realm, began to break down. Local officials ignored imperial command. Counts and dukes treated their territories as personal fiefdoms. The networks of patronage and obligation that had held the empire together frayed and snapped. In 840, Louis the Pious died on an island in the Rhine, near the city of Mainz. He had spent his final years trying to hold together an empire that was already crumbling around him. According to the chroniclers, his last words were a prayer for mercy, a plea that God might forgive him his failings as a ruler and as a father. He was buried in the Abbey of St. Tarnulf in Metz, in a tomb that would later be destroyed, his legacy overshadowed by the civil wars that followed his death. The man who had inherited the greatest empire in Western Christendom had been too gentle, too trusting, too pious to hold it together. And now, his three surviving sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, would fight over the pieces. The war that followed was brutal and unforgiving. Lothair, as the eldest and the co-emperor, claimed the entire inheritance. Louis the German, who had ruled Bavaria for years, demanded his share. Charles the Bald, the youngest and his mother Judith's favorite, refused to be left with nothing. For 3 years, the brothers mingled and fought, their armies clashing across the Frankish heartland. The great nobles watched, calculating their own interests, shifting their allegiances as the fortunes of war shifted. In 841, the two younger brothers, Louis and Charles, allied against Lothair. At the Battle of Fontenoy in Burgundy, they met their elder brother's army in a conflict so bloody that the chroniclers wrote of it with horror. The fields ran with blood, they said. The flower of Frankish nobility was cut down. Brother fought against brother, cousin against cousin, and when the battle was over, Lothair was defeated but not destroyed. Fontenoy marked a turning point. The brothers understood now that none of them could defeat the others decisively. They were locked in a stalemate, their armies exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their nobles weary of war. In 842, Louis and Charles met in Strasbourg, the city that would one day become a symbol of Franco-German conflict, and they swore an oath of alliance. The Oaths of Strasbourg are one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the Carolingian era, not only for their political significance, but for the languages in which they were recorded. Louis the German, who ruled the eastern Frankish lands, swore his oath in a Romance language, the ancestor of French, so that the soldiers of Charles the Bald could understand him. Charles, who ruled the western Frankish lands, swore his oath in a Germanic language, the ancestor of German, so that Louis's warriors could understand. The moment captured something essential about the future of Europe. The unified Frankish Empire, which had stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, was dividing along linguistic and cultural lines. The languages that would become French and German were asserting themselves, carving out the territories that would become France and Germany. The alliance between Louis and Charles forced Lothair to the negotiating table. In 843, the three brothers met at Verdun, a town in northeastern France, and agreed to a treaty that would reshape Europe. The Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. Lothair, as the eldest, received the imperial title and the Middle Kingdom, a long, narrow strip of territory stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, running through Aachen and Rome, a corridor of land that included the old Frankish heartland and the imperial capital. Louis the German received Eastern Kingdom, the lands beyond the Rhine, the territories that would eventually become Germany. Charles the Bald received the Western Kingdom, the lands that would eventually become France. The borders were drawn not by rivers or mountains, but by political expediency, a division that would create tensions for 1,000 years. The Treaty of Verdun was supposed to bring peace. Signed in the summer of 843, it was meant to be the final settlement, the document that would end the wars between the sons of Louis the Pious and establish a stable order for the Carolingian kingdom. But treaties drawn in blood are rarely honored for long. The brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, returned to their respective kingdom, each carrying the memory of battles fought and betrayals endured, each nursing the quiet conviction that the division had been unfair, that the other brothers had received more than their share. The peace they had sworn to uphold was never more than a pause between conflicts. For Lothair the eldest, the treaty had given him the imperial title in the Middle Kingdom, a sprawling corridor of land that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, encompassing Aachen, the old Frankish heartland, and Rome itself. On paper, it was the richest and most prestigious of the three divisions. In practice, it was ungovernable. The Middle Kingdom had no natural boundary, no unifying geography, no single culture or language. It was a strip of territory carved out of the old empire, a political abstraction that existed only on parchment. Lothair spent his years as emperor trying to hold this artificial creation together, moving from one crisis to another, fighting rebels in Italy, suppressing uprisings in Frisia, negotiating with his brothers who watched from east and west, waiting for him to fail. When he died in 855, he did what his father had done before him. He divided his kingdom among his three sons. The Middle Kingdom shattered into fragments: Italy, Lotharingia, and Provence, each ruled by a son who would soon find himself caught between the ambitions of his uncle. The fragmentation of Lothair's kingdom marked the beginning of the end for the Carolingian dream. The three brothers who had divided the empire at Verdun were replaced by a generation of cousins, each with claims to territories that overlapped and conflicted. Louis the German, ruling in the east, watched as his nephews squabbled over the scraps of Lothair's realm, and he saw opportunity. Charles the Bald, ruling in the west, saw the same opportunity. The two brothers, who had sworn oaths of alliance at Strasbourg, found themselves competing for influence over their nephew's territories, their old alliance dissolving into rivalry. The pattern that had torn apart the generation of Louis the Pious, brother against brother, oath against oath, was repeating itself, but now with more players and more claim, a tangled web of family relationships that made conflict inevitable. The 9th century was a brutal time to be a Carolingian king. The threats that had been gathering on the frontiers during Charlemagne's reign, the Vikings in the north, the Saracens in the south, the Magyars in the east, now broke over the divided kingdoms like waves over a crumbling sea. The Viking raids, which had been sporadic during Charlemagne's lifetime, became a constant plague. Their long ships, shallow enough to navigate the rivers, could appear anywhere at any time. They struck Paris in 845, sailing up the Seine with a fleet of more than 100 ships, demanding tribute from Charles the Bald. They sacked Hamburg, burned Utrecht, and established permanent settlements in Frisia and along the coast of Ireland. They built a camp on the island of Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire, and used it as a base for raids deep into Frankish territory. The great monasteries that Charlemagne had patronized, the centers of learning and culture that had preserved the legacy of the Carolingian Renaissance, were looted and burned. The monks fled, carrying their precious manuscripts, the copies of ancient texts that had been made in Carolingian scriptoria, and the light of learning flickered and dimmed. The Carolingian kings struggled to respond. Charles the Bald issued edicts calling for the construction of fortified bridges to block the Viking ships, but the bridges took years to build, and the Vikings simply sailed around them. Louis the German raised armies to fight the Magyar, but the Magyars were horsemen, masters of the feigned retreat and the sudden ambush, and the Frankish heavy infantry could not catch them. The great nobles of the kingdoms, who had once looked to the Carolingian kings for protection and patronage, began to look elsewhere. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and made their own alliances. The machinery of Carolingian governance, which had been designed to administer a unified empire, could not function in a world of divided kingdoms and external threats. In the Western Kingdom, the decline of Carolingian authority was stark and rapid. Charles the Bald, despite his name, was a capable ruler, intelligent, ambitious, and determined to maintain his family's legacy. But he was fighting a losing battle. The Viking raids drained his treasury, the demands of defense exhausted his army, and the great nobles of his kingdom increasingly independent. In 877, as Charles was returning from a campaign in Italy, he fell ill and died, crossing the pass of Mont Cenis in the Alps. The chronicler who recorded his death noted that his body was carried back to France in a cart, wrapped in waxed cloth, and that the great men of the kingdom did not come to meet it. The king who had fought for decades to hold his realm together was buried without ceremony, his passing marked by silence and indifference. Charles's son, Louis the Stammerer, ruled for only 2 years before dying at the age of 33. His sons, Louis III and Charlemagne, were children when they inherited the throne, and they ruled jointly, a desperate attempt to maintain unity in the face of disintegration. Louis III won a famous victory against the Vikings at Saucourt in 881, a battle celebrated in an old High German poem that survives to this day. But he died of a fever 3 years later, thrown from his horse while pursuing a young woman, a trivial end for a king who had once seemed capable of restoring his family's fortunes. Charlemagne, his brother, died of a hunting accident shortly afterward. The Western Kingdom, which had been the heartland of the Carolingian Empire, now had no adult Carolingian heir. The great nobles looked at the wreckage of the dynasty and decided to choose a king of their own. They selected Odo, the Count of Paris, a man who had won fame defending his city against the Viking, a man whose family had risen from obscurity through military prowess. The Carolingian dynasty, which had seized the throne from the Merovingian, was now being set aside by the very men who had once sworn loyalty to it. But the Carolingians were not finished. The family that had risen from the shadows once could rise again. In 893, a young Carolingian claimant named Charles the Simple, so called because of his trusting nature, though the epithet would later take on a crueler meaning, was crowned king in opposition to Odo. For 5 years, the two kings fought for control of the Western Kingdom, a civil war that further weakened the already fractured realm. When Odo died in 898, Charles the Simple finally emerged as the sole ruler. He was a man of moderate ability, neither the warrior his dynasty had produced nor the weakling his nickname suggested. He negotiated with the Viking, granting their leader Rollo a territory along the Seine that would become Normandy, a decision that would echo through European history. He fought against the great nobles who sought to limit his power, winning some battles and losing others. For a time, it seemed that the Carolingians might recover their authority, that the dynasty might rise again from the ashes of its own collapse. But the forces that had undermined the Carolingians were too powerful to be reversed. The great nobles had tasted independence, had built their own castles and raised their own armies, and they had no intention of returning to the centralized rule of Charlemagne's time. In the Eastern Kingdom, the Carolingian line of Louis the German had already given way to a new dynasty. In 911, when Louis the Child, the last Eastern Carolingian, died without an heir, the great dukes of Germany elected Conrad of Franconia as their king. The Carolingian dynasty, which had ruled the Eastern Franks for more than a century, was replaced by a succession of non-Carolingian houses, the Conradians, the Atenians, the Salian, who would build the kingdom that would become the Holy Roman Empire. The blood of Charlemagne still flowed in the veins of many of these new rulers. The families had intermarried across generations, but the dynasty itself, the direct line of succession, had ended. In the Western Kingdom, the Carolingians clung to power for another generation. Charles the Simple was overthrown by his own nobles in 922, imprisoned, and left to die in a fortress at Péronne. His son, Louis IV, was raised in exile at the court of the English king and returned to France as a young man to claim his inheritance. He fought against the rising power of the Capetian counts, the family that would eventually supplant his own, and he managed, through a combination of diplomacy and military skill, to keep the Carolingian flag flying. But his victories were temporary, his alliances fragile. When he died in 954, his son, Lothair, inherited a kingdom that was Carolingian in name only. The great nobles of France, the Counts of Flanders, the Dukes of Normandy, the Counts of Anjou, ruled their territories as independent princes, acknowledging the king's authority only when it suited them. Lothair spent his reign trying to reassert control, fighting against his cousins in the east, struggling against the rising power of the Capetian family, but the tide of history was against him. In 987, Louis V, the last Carolingian king of the Western Franks, died in a hunting accident. He was 20 years old without an heir, and his death marked the final end of the dynasty that had ruled the Franks for more than 2 centuries. The great nobles of the realm gathered to choose his successor, and they passed over the Carolingian claimant, Charles of Lorraine, the uncle of the dead king. They chose instead Hugh Capet, the Duke of the Franks, a man whose family had served the Carolingians for generations, who had built a power base in the Isle de France that would become the nucleus of the French kingdom. The Capetian dynasty, which would rule France for more than 800 years, took the throne that the Carolingians had seized from the Merovingian. The wheel had turned again. The end of the Carolingian dynasty was not a dramatic collapse, not a single battle or a decisive moment that historians can point to at the end of an era. It was a slow, quiet dissolution, a fading of power and relevance that stretched across decades. The last Carolingian, Charles the Simple, Louis IV, Lothair V, were not villains or fools. They were men who inherited a position that had become untenable, who struggled against forces they could not control, who fought to preserve a legacy that was already slipping through their fingers. They watched as the world their ancestors had built crumbled around them, and they could do nothing to stop it. But the Carolingian legacy did not crumble. It endured, transformed, woven into the fabric of European civilization. The institutions that the Carolingians had created, the relationship between church and state, the ideal of a Christian commonwealth, the administrative structures that would evolve into medieval governance, survived the collapse of their dynasty. The Carolingian Renaissance, that brief flowering of learning and culture, preserved the texts that would nourish the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, the monasteries of Fulda and Saint-Denis, the manuscripts copied in Carolingian scriptoria, these remain, testaments to a time when Europe had been unified under a single vision. The division of the Carolingian Empire at Verdun created the geographical framework for the nations of Europe. The Western Kingdom, the lands of Charles the Bald, would evolve into France. The Eastern Kingdom, the lands of Louis the German, would evolve into Germany. The Middle Kingdom, the lands of Lothair, would become the source of centuries of conflict. Lorraine, Alsace, Burgundy, the Low Country, a contested borderland that would be fought over for 1,000 years. The languages that emerged from the Carolingian world, the Romance languages of the West, the Germanic languages of the East, carried within them the echoes of the oaths of Strasbourg, that moment when 2 brothers spoke to each other in languages that were becoming distinct, when the unity of the Frankish Empire first showed its cracks. And yet, for all that the Carolingians built, there is a melancholy that clings to their story. They rose from obscurity through ambition and violence, seized a crown that was not theirs, built an empire that stretched across Europe, and then watched as it shattered in their hand. They were not the first dynasty to reach for greatness and fail to hold it, and they would not be the last. But there is something particularly poignant about the Carolingian collapse, something that speaks to the fragility of all human achievement. Charlemagne had dreamed of a Christian empire, a unified Christendom, a civilization that would endure until the end of time. His grandsons, fighting over the pieces of his dream, could not see past their own ambition. They divided his empire as their father had divided the empire of Charlemagne, and as their sons would divide it again, each generation carving smaller pieces from the whole, until nothing was left but fragments. The family that built Europe did not intend to build the nations that would replace their empire. They intended to build something eternal, something that would outlast the rise and fall of dynasties, something that would stand as a monument to their glory. But the eternal is not given to mortal hands to build. The Carolingians built, and what they built was magnificent, and then it passed away, as all things must. The Palatine Chapel still stands in Aachen, a jewel of stone and light, but the empire that surrounded it is gone. The manuscripts that the Carolingian scribes copied still survive in libraries across Europe, but the scriptoria that produced them are silent. The borders that the Carolingians drew still shape the map of Europe, but the dynasty that drew them is remembered only in history books. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the legacy of the Carolingians is not the empire they failed to preserve, but the civilization they helped to create. They took the fragments of the Roman world and the traditions of the Germanic peoples and forged something new, something that was not Roman and not Germanic but European. They gave Europe its shape, its languages, its institution, its memory of what it had been and what it might become. They were not saints. These men and women who rose from the shadows of the Merovingian throne, who fought their way across battlefields and built cathedrals and copied manuscripts and divided kingdoms among their squabbling sons. They were human, all too human, with all the flaws and frailties that come with being human. And in their humanity, in their striving and their failing, they left behind a world that still bears their mark. The torchlight that flickered in that Frankish hall, the moment when a mother whispered to her son that he must be sharper than his enemy, that light did not die. It passed from generation to generation, from Pepin to Charles to Louis to the brothers who tore the empire apart, and from them to the people of Europe who inherited the fragments of their dream. It flickered, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, but it never went out. The family that built Europe did not build it to last forever. They built it to endure, to grow, to change, to become something that no single family could ever control. And in that, perhaps, they succeeded beyond their wildest dream. They built not an empire but a civilization, and that civilization, for all its struggles and failures, still stands.